So if you are someone who eventually wants to reach a rating of 2000 plus FIDE or something similar online, this video is going to be very important for you. And quite frankly, I don't think I've seen any other people make any videos about this topic online, so buckle up, it's going to be a good one. And it's basically about the two brains that are required to reach this level. And disclaimer, if you know any London system players, they likely have neither. So basically, what are the two chess brains I am talking about? And to really understand this, I'm going to put up two images of players on the screen who have very opposing styles. Capablanca on the left was a very kind of intuitive, more positional player, whereas Kasparov on the right, very balls to the wall, aggressive, trying to always calculate as many lines out as possible. And both approaches are completely valid to the game of chess, but it is important to understand this dichotomy before we really get into the crux of the issue. And the issue is not that either of these styles are inherently right or wrong, but it's that for most players under 2000, they primarily think like way too intuitively to the expense of not really thinking logically enough, like not calculating enough, for example, when they play their games, or they think like way too logically without tapping into their intuition enough. And if we go back to look at these sort of players like Kasparov and Capablanca, while they were primarily like, for example, in Capablanca's case, like intuitive player, that doesn't mean that he couldn't calculate. And let's say you do want to reach 2000, right, and you're not yet there. This doesn't mean that you need to be amazing at both. Quite frankly, you're probably not going to be able to discuss this in another video, but you can't completely suck at one of these, at least from what I've seen. It's just very rare that you can actually reach this level having that be the case. To also understand where you are specifically, I thought it would help to outline the 4 different types of chess personalities that exist. Good old Mark Dvoretsky, if you don't know him, you probably should. But anyways, he's written a lot of good books, and unfortunately he's no longer with us, but one of the best chess trainers of all time. And he basically said, again, that there were 4 types of chess players. He used different words other than positional and attacking, but for the sake of this video and being as simplistic as possible, I'm going to use those terms. And basically, the different types of players were basically a combination of either logical or an intuitive player, or a more like positional or attacking. So for example, Kasparov was a more like logical attacking player, you could say. And on the other hand, with Capablanca, the example we gave earlier, right, he would fit more onto this intuitive and positional with players like Karpov, Carlsen, etc. But that being said, you could also be like logical and more positional, or like intuitive and more attacking, right? Just because you're intuitive doesn't mean you play more attacking or positional or vice versa. Okay, hopefully that is clear. But let's say you're this intuitive player, right? You're under 2000, and same thing for the logical player. I want to go over what are the kind of typical strengths and weaknesses that you have in your play, so you kind of know like, what is it necessarily that, I should be looking to maybe improve in my game. And also I should say, like, you don't necessarily need to look at your weaknesses and be like, I'm going to make this my strength. Oftentimes it's just more effective to take your strength and make it stronger and just bring your weakness up, but it's not as weak. Anyways, so the intuitive player who is under 2000, what are their strengths typically? Well, it's typically, at least from what I've seen from, again, my own students, they play somewhat fast. Time management is not really a big issue. They also have, like, either, depending whether they're more of a, and this is a generalization, but whether they're more like positional or attacking player, either they're going to have a pretty decent feel for like, the attacking aspects of the game, like sacrifice and initiative and all that, or the more like positional and strategic elements. Their typical weaknesses, though, on the other hand, are often the kind of actually the opposite of what I was saying earlier, right? They do play fast, but sometimes they play too fast and actually make a lot of calculation errors just out of being too sloppy. Very often they go for good looking moves, but just, don't really calculate them very deeply, and that can lead to just a lot of concrete mistakes in the games that get punished. But okay, I just wanted to bring up one of my students' games to illustrate one of the common issues that very often happens with these more intuitive players, again, to use that label, where very often, as I was saying, they kind of go for moves that are maybe a good looking, not thoroughly calculated though, and this is a common way things can go wrong. So what happened was g6 check, attacking the king, very logical. If you take that, there's going to be a very forcing sequence at the very least winning the queen there. So king f6 was played, and at this point there should be many winning lines like queen h4, take, and this would probably transpose to the line that we just looked at. But unfortunately what happened was this move bishop g5 check. And it was played fairly quickly. King takes g5 happened, and at this point technically queen takes g7 is still winning, but you know, it's not super forcing, it's understandable that was not went for. He gave another check, takes, another check, king f7, and all of a sudden, believe it or not, black is completely winning. White's attack has pretty much ran out. There's no good checks unless it's you plan on giving up even more material. But okay, what really went wrong here, because this was very sudden, and it was basically just the fact that, you know, back here, we just very carelessly sacrificed a piece. We didn't properly calculate it through. Yeah, maybe it was still technically winning after bishop g5 take, but at the end of the day, we need to be properly calculating that out before we make such a committal decision. Not just thinking like, oh yeah, this looks right, because at the end of the day, that mentality is going to lose you probably quite a lot of games. And really in a position like this, you just kind of need to knuckle down for a bit, calculate out some lines and figure out where the win is, because I mean, for king that weak, it's not going to be lasting much longer. But okay, onto the more logical player again, under 2000. By the way, I would probably say I'm more of like the intuitive type, but growing up I was probably a bit more logical, and then over time became more intuitive. Anyways, so typically the strengths of these players are going to be more that they kind of calculate a bit more thoroughly, and these players can often be frustrating for more of the intuitive types, who oftentimes they might like be going into some like wild sacrifices or something, and the logical player will just sit there and calculate things out until they see a good line, which can very often refute the like genius idea or whatever. But yeah, otherwise, like if they're maybe more the positional logical type, they might also, you know, just be better at kind of not necessarily just pure calculation, but just coming up with the right strategic ideas in a position from more just principled kind of thinking. The weaknesses of this type of player, though, on the other hand, are very often that they just like overcalculate. They're like trying to calculate everything and not relying enough on just their intuitions, like what they feel is the right idea in the position. This was definitely something that I struggled with growing up quite a bit, and what this leads to a lot of time trouble issues, from what I've seen at least firsthand, and I can definitely attest to that as well. I had a lot of time trouble issues growing up. Another thing that I also struggled with when I was this more like logical type of player was I just overthought in a lot of like more simple positions. I might spend like, let's say in a classical game where I have 90 minutes, I just spend like 10 minutes on a move, where it's like I end up just playing a move that I could have played without really much calculation, to be honest, but I was just overthinking it. And even still, this does happen from time to time for me. This was one example of a game that I pulled up from a international tournament I played last year. This particular game I was playing against a FIDE master, and what I ended up doing in this position after my opponent played his last move, g5, I spent about 10 minutes, which was probably a bit too much in hindsight, and while the move I did end up playing turned out to be the best move according to Stockfish, I really should have just played it a lot quicker. And the reason I didn't play it quicker was because I had this huge dilemma where I was thinking, he's going to play this move g4, he's going to carve out all these light squares, and I'm like, should I go for this move h3 and stop it, or should I not? And I spent quite a long time deliberating over this, and at the end of the day, I should have just made a more intuitive call, because you're never really going to be able to calculate this sort of thing to a definitive conclusion. You're just not going to be able to. And the reason is that there's like so many different things black can do after you play h3. There's no like particular forcing line. So at the end of the day, you're just going to have to make a more intuitive call with that. And so I ended up playing this move knight to e2 with the idea that, you know, if allowed, I might play knight to d4 and try to get my knight to this square. Its weakness on c6 in particular. Again, I should have just made this decision a lot quicker. The reason I didn't go for h3, by the way, was just I felt I was weakening the structure a little bit. Whereas, like, you know, if the pawn stays on h2, it just feels a lot more solid. These guys all kind of work together in harmony a bit better. At least that's what I believe. But okay, again, we're going to talk more about these sort of decisions soon. And I would actually call this a simple decision, to be clear. And typically in these sorts of positions, you want to avoid spending too much time, because at the end of the day, like, even if there is some difference between h3 and knight e2, like, it's not going to be that big. It's not going to actually, most likely at least, be the thing that completely determines the outcome of the game. And that brings me to the 4 types of decisions that exist in chess, and understanding this is very important because it's going to help give you a bit of a framework for, like, okay, I'm this sort of player, this is the sort of decisions that I struggle with and ultimately need to improve upon. Because at the end of the day, chess is not a game of, like, the, Caro-Kann opening or whatever opening, right? It's not about openings, it's about decision making. And yeah, openings matter a bit, I talk about them sometimes on the channel, but at the end of the day, the person who wins a chess game is probably not the person who has the fancier opening repertoire. It's probably the person who is just better at making decisions over the course of the game. That being said, though, I didn't make these 4 types of decisions up. It was actually a grandmaster, Jakob Aagaard. He actually, let me get a book. Apologies. So he has this book called Thinking Inside the Box. I read it when I was, don't even remember, probably a few years ago, and he talks about these 4 types of decisions in there, and it is relevant, I think, to a lot of players, probably not just like grandmasters or whatever. But he basically says there are automatic decisions, which is like, something just automatic, right? Like, you're playing opening theory. If someone captures your piece, you take it back. Coming on to simple decisions, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I didn't fully define it. So what are these? You can kind of think of it as like you have maybe more of a quiet position, not so tactical. Doesn't mean there's no tactics that exist within the position, but very often these sort of ones, again, you don't want to be spending too much time. You want to just be able to make quick, good enough, not perfect always, decisions. And it's important to understand the reason why it's enough to make, good enough moves is because the difference between maybe the first best move and the 5th best move is maybe not going to be that much between, like, compared to maybe the first or 2nd best move. So on the other hand, though, if we have critical decisions, these are quite different, right? Like, it's where, I mean, just by the name of it, critical, this could perhaps decide the entire result of the game, whether you make the right or wrong move here. So unlike a simple decision where, like, there's a bit more leeway for not playing the best move, in a critical one, if you play the first move compared to the 2nd best move, or 2nd best move you play that instead of the best one, like, there could be quite a big gap there where instead of, let's say, drawing the game, you lose, or instead of winning, you draw the game. And this is, again, kind of what I was talking about earlier. If you tend to be more of this intuitive type of player, you might make a lot of concrete mistakes in your calculations, and this might be one of the biggest gaps in your game at the moment. It certainly was for me at one point. That being said, strategic, complex, I'm not going to dive into this too much now. It's a little bit of a combination of simple and critical. These are often types of, let's say, for example, you make a positional sacrifice. That could probably fit into this. Given the nature of such a sacrifice, you're probably not going to be able to fully calculate out, is this good or not? It requires a certain level of intuition and seeing out into the future, but you also can't fully calculate it out into the future just because of the nature of what is going on. Anyway, so I want to focus on these 2 in particular. I'm going to show 2 examples right now. But okay, here's the first position that I want to show. You might also want to think, like, what type of moment is this? And you can hopefully probably correctly tell this is a more critical moment, right? Where you're going to have to sit down and actually calculate things out, because, I mean, look at the situation, right? We're down in exchange, actually. All of our pieces are aiming at the king. If we just back off, like we retreat our bishop or something, we're going to lose a bit of that momentum and speed that we need to really have when we have, like, first of all, with down material, and we have this one moment in time, right, where all our pieces are aiming at their king. If we lose that, we might never get that moment again. So my opponent definitely, oh sorry, not my opponent, but my student rather, definitely recognizes, and he buckled down trying to calculate something out. But even in the end, he still unfortunately got this wrong. And yeah, so what he ended up doing was, you might also want to pause and try to think, what would you do? He ended up playing this move, rook takes g7, which looks like it might be winning after queen g3. But unfortunately, he missed an opponent's resource. And you might want to pause and think, what did he miss? But he unfortunately overlooked queen c6 check, f3, and the queen coming to g6. His opponent first run rook d1 check, but queen g6 is also good. Rook d1, king g2, queen g6 is how it went. But yeah, after this is just you can resign because now this is cut off and black is up way too much material for this to be salvageable. Another common move, since I've shown this position to another few students since, is queen f6. Unfortunately, this also falls a little bit short after queen b7 check, f3, and now very nice move. You might want to pause and think, what is it? But rook d1, just stopping any rook takes g7 ideas because of the basically pin there to the king. And if you take the rook, well then you hang your queen. Luckily though, white does have a bit of a saving move. Queen takes f7 check, and then after all is said and done, this pawn, this endgame is a pawn up. But you know, do we really get this position to be hoping for a pawn up endgame? Probably not. However, as some of you may have seen, bishop takes g7 is just very clean in terms of how it wins. Bishop takes g7, queen g2 is probably the cleanest. There's no checks on this diagonal. Queen f6 also works and is good enough though. But I just want to highlight, right, like some of this stuff, while the correct idea is actually not too difficult to calculate, it might take a bit of time if you see one of these other moves for us to properly see why they're wrong. And a very common thing that again happens in the games of players who have more of these like logical player tendencies is they tend to spend a lot of time on more simple decisions and often get into time trouble, meaning that when they get to these moments, they don't actually have that much time to properly think things through and calculate, which means that they are more likely to just not see the correct idea. And so I have quite a few other videos in this channel about time management, but I can't stress this enough that one of the things that not enough people think about is how is my time management earlier in the game going to affect my ability to see the things correctly at critical moments later on when they likely will arise. But okay, switching gears, you might want to think, what type of position is it we have in front of us right now? And hopefully, since we also just covered a critical moment, you'd be able to guess this is more of a simple moment or simple decision we need to make. And one framework I like to use in these sorts of ones, and I talked about in a somewhat recent video where I talked about the WOP method, you can go check that out, I'll have it up in the card somewhere, is when you have again these more quiet moments, not like a super tactical mess like the previous position. I like to ask these three questions. What are the weaknesses? That's the W in WOP. What is the opponent's idea? And then the pieces, or specifically the worst placed piece. Maybe I should have called it WOW, I don't know. But by focusing on these elements in the position, you're often able to direct your attention to the things that are most relevant in, again, these sort of more quiet positions. If you were to ask that in this position, it probably doesn't make so much sense because things are not slow, things are very tactical. Like, you know, you might say your king's your worst placed piece and be like, oh, I need to like move my king up. Like, obviously that's just not gonna yield much good. So, okay, back to this position though. This is black to move, and you might want to think like, okay, given these factors in the position, what should I do? But okay, hopefully you've had a bit of a think. And what I ended up going for in the game was this move knight to g7 with the idea to, it's kind of twofold actually. So one, my knight on h5 is a pretty just not great piece. However, I also have another piece which is not particularly great, which is this bishop on d7, which is basically entrapped by kind of the pawn chain to some degree where all the pawns are on light squares and the bishop is on the same color. And so knight g7 again improves, or tries to improve the knight. I mean, at the moment it doesn't look too great, but it prepares now bishop f5 so we can take back, not just lose material. And in doing so, we trade off this bad piece while also help activate our knight at the same time. So let's say they play a random move like rook e1, bishop f5, we take, and now our knight can come to a more central square like d6, where it's going to have a lot of influence over the board. And at this point, we're doing pretty alright. Can't say we're better, but we're probably around equal. Another common move that people give is knight f6. It's probably alright, but again, you're not really addressing the other issue in the position. You address this knight on h5, but you don't address this bishop on d7. I've also had some people suggest in this position to go like f5, but hopefully you can recognize, given our talk about this dark squared bishop, that putting another pawn on a light square probably is not going to be doing this guy any favors, so probably we should avoid making such a move. Again though, the details of the position aside, this is a sort of One where you want to be trying to make more of a quick decision, not overthinking it. Okay, maybe you don't see knight g7, maybe you in the end decide on knight f6. It's not the best thing in the world, but your position is still playable, it's still reasonably solid, right? It's probably better in a practical game if you spend like 3 minutes on knight f6 as opposed to like 10 minutes on knight g7, because at least there you have more time. Even if the position is a little bit worse, in the long run that extra time will add up a little bit. It's always not always that simplistic, but I think a lot of players don't take enough into account this more practical element of just how important time on the clock actually is in a real chess game. But anyways, I'm going to wrap up the video around here. If you want to actually work with me more one-on-one, I have a coaching form down in the description below. But for the rest of you, I hope you guys have a good day.